You will now be placed into the conference.
Related to climate change and seeing how distribution in our bird species are expected to evolve in response to climate change, and looking at natural disturbances in our neck of the woods. And then after that, started thinking about having discussions about caribou, and then we started realizing that this type of project could be quite important in terms of scope, in terms of multidisciplinary, but also in terms of spatial coverage. So and it kind of coincided to some extent with new objectives or mandate that's been given by higher level management in terms of trying to implement the pan-Canadian approach, and also inform the Species at Risk program, trying to look at more multi-species planning, thinking about like documents such as South of the Divide, for example, that includes multiple species at risk in the same area, and try to build some recovery strategies accordingly. So that's kind of, without even suffice to say that we're also looking at, again, priority species, priority places, priority sectors, and also providing important information pertaining to environmental assessment. So that's kind of like the rationale about why we started working on that project, and kind of realized that it was also a need and an awesome opportunity to actually make it really multidisciplinary, and acknowledge the need for us, CWS, to partner up with SNT partners, partner up with NRCan, and also partner up with provincial and territorial partners. So I think that's a great opportunity to create pretty much an interesting precedent here. And also want to kind of clearly acknowledge that as far as I'm concerned, I would like to maybe take a little bit of credit of having a vision of some sort, but then after that, it's all the others. And we've seen that impressive list of contributors on the contractors team, but also in terms of providing some guidance, we put together that advisory committee. So I want to particularly acknowledge Mathieu Leblanc and Julien Tremblay, who've been involved in the whole pushing all the paperwork required to get these projects going, and they've been involved in every single step throughout. We have some so-called subject matter experts, pretty much mirroring what the contractors team have in place, but providing that kind of technical advisory support. So we have bird models, we have Rhiannon, Lisa, and Steve that are colleague member biologists. We also have some caribou or SAR biologists from different parts of the country. So Isabelle Duclos here in the office, James Hudson, the GNWT rep, Amanda Dookie, and Anna Colbert, also from Ottawa and Gatineau. Mary Fass was involved as someone who provided recommendations and suggestions regarding protected areas, and more recently we're quite excited to have Jean Polfus being part of the group and providing a whole other dimension to this work that we're hoping to actually explore further, which is looking at working more with our Indigenous partners and trying to engage and incorporate some traditional knowledge as well. So that's pretty much it for me.
Thank you, Sam. So I'm going to present a little bit more about from our side. So the introduction is still coming. So this is the approximate agenda. We sent this out. So we will slowly make it through all of this in the next 2 hours and 50 minutes or so. And we will dive in. A couple logistic things. It sounds like everybody has successfully muted themselves when they're not speaking. That is really helpful and very important, so continue to do that, please. Second point, we would like people to, in the chat channel or I guess email or something, please indicate that you're here to us, because there are a number of people who are just labeled calling user, and each of those could be one or more people. So just give us basically so we know who is here. That would be very helpful. And the last point, I think, is that if you have something to say, you can obviously try to just interject by unmuting. But you can also, there is a little hand beside your name under the list of participants. There's a little hand that's raised hand. So you can try that, and we have some people monitoring that. So that might also work if you have something to say. The basic principle here is that we have a project that's completed, officially completed March of 2019, or 19, and we have a proposal in place that's going forward. Colloquially, we have been referring to the one that's completed as the Northwest Territories Project, NWT, and the one that's about to start is the Western Boreal Project, so that's WB. So it's, and the reason for this particular meeting is because we submitted we submitted this final report for the first project, and we submitted an early version of a proposal for the second version, and the advisory committee had a series of questions, and this is mostly to answer them. Question 15 is the first one we're going to jump into, and it was about questions regarding SpaDES. And the questions were, please provide an overview of why SpaDES would be the best platform available to address these types of broad-scale and multidisciplinary questions, and what exactly is the benefit to integrating the wildlife models into SpaDES as opposed to having separate species habitat models being applied to output from SpaDES. So I'm going to take a few minutes to address certainly the first question here, and it's basically why SpaDES? So I'm going to do a very brief backstory. Steve Cumming and I were professors at Laval University, and we were both doing landscape modeling, and we realized we had lots of projects on the go, and we were trying to train graduate students how to do landscape modeling. And essentially, we got stuck more often than not. I was teaching SpaDES, Steve was teaching various other tools or languages, and over a few years, I taught 70-plus graduate students, and one of them was successful in publishing their work. Perhaps it's become two now after a decade. So that ratio of effort of teaching people and their success was very concerning, and I realized that even though I was able to, publish some stuff with SpaDES, I'd been working with it for 7 years, I was not able to. There was still something missing there was nothing that I knew how to deal with or what to do to deal with this problem. And so what we did was I hired, a few years later, as we're trying to come up with an idea of what we needed, I hired Pierre Racine to evaluate several different platforms. And he spent a little bit of time learning about several of them, including NetLogo, SpaDES, Repast, Mason, there's a few others. And he set up a series of evaluation criteria. And what happened is we, in the, let's say the three in the middle of this table, NetLogo, SpaDES, and Repast, they, according to various criteria, he scored them, and the total for each was not as high as we had hoped, and more importantly, there were key areas that they were missing some things. So even though they might be quite good at some things, and those things would be very worthwhile taking advantage of, the fact that they were missing out on some of the other things was making it difficult. And so this table, without this left-hand column, which didn't exist at the time, became one of the motivating factors for creating something new. We didn't know what it was going to be at the time. Some experiences with SpaDES. I had a graduate student, Steve had a graduate student, I was sort of a co-advisor, Julien Beguin, who developed an entire chapter based on simulating with SpaDES, and we came up to a new feature that he didn't know how to do, or we didn't have available, and he tried and couldn't solve it, and he asked me to solve it, and I tried, and I couldn't do it, and it turned out, I looked at R at that point, and I realized that someone had made a package to do the exact thing that we needed to do, which was some sort of a derivative of a least cost path algorithm, and I knew that Andrew Fall was able to do that, but I wasn't able to tap into his capabilities. So what we ended up doing was we ended up running this R function for doing these least cost paths, and then we would move it in and out of SpaDES, and it just seemed like we eventually published that paper. It was an interesting thing, but it really emphasized the fact that it was going to be difficult to build enhancements to this tool. And so these are some of the various reasons that we came to the realization that we needed to create something new. Okay, I am going to, the issue that we are, overarching issue that we're talking about here is about land management. And I'm going to present it as a problem of prediction. So what that means is we are taking actions today on the landscape. We are making decisions today, and what we need to know, ideally, is what are the consequences of those actions in the future. And if we know what the consequences of those are in the future, then we can be either more confident or we might make different choices than what may seem correct today. So the critical point here is that this is a problem of prediction. And so I'm going to switch over to the presentation that Series has just created and just gave yesterday at the British Ecological Society. This one's a little bit truncated for this purpose. And it's what this SpaDES platform is enabling is this predictive ecology in a new way. And I'm going to describe it as a perfect approach with a slight twist on the spelling. So it's clear that we have some challenges that are widespread that are related to, climate, but also other things. And these are the decision frame that we need to be making. And so this is sort of a general talk, and I'm going to jump straight into, what SpaDES and predictive ecology is trying to do. The best way that I've found to really describe this is to think of the IPCC. And what the IPCC has been doing for the past almost 20 years now is getting a whole bunch of people together with various diverse expertise and bringing many models together and running them, projecting with them, and then revisiting that in 5 or so year windows. And some of the critical things that they've done is they bring a lot of people together with a lot of expertise, and they have many models. And at no point do they try to simplify the situation because they figured out which model is the correct model. And it's always an issue of multiple models are the only way to go because all models are wrong. And so what we have see with this IPCC is a very good model of how to do this sort of thing. The challenge with the IPCC is that it takes a long time, every 5 years, and a lot of people to make this happen. So what predictive ecology is and what we're presenting and preparing with this SpaDES platform is really about enabling this whole idea of the IPCC at any scale, whether it's a small group of 5 people, 25 people, 100 people, or 600 people. We need this type of capacity for all situations. There are a few things that we need in order to do that. Key are interoperability and reusability. And I'm going to just briefly go into them. Some people have obviously highlighted the importance of reproducing, which is a new, subtly different word from the one at the top of the screen, which is reusability. And we basically, we use the word reusability as something that's more encompassing than reproducing. If you can reuse your model in any context, it presupposes that it's also reproducible. So reusability is a higher, stronger standard. So some of the hurdles that many of us have had are some of these things like reproducing someone else's work or our own. What happens? How do we change or update models that we finished 3 months ago or 3 years ago? And what do we do when we have a model and we bring it to a different context? And so this is where this perfect comes in. So moving to ecology towards prediction. Predictive ecology is about having reusable tools, reusable models that are freely available, interoperable, that are part of continuous workflows and that are tested automatically. And when you achieve these, then most of these hurdles start to fade away. And in the process of creating this perfect approach, have been growing pains for our group, but it's becoming part of, as we solve those problems, then they become usable by anybody else who are doing this. And so this is just another way of showing what that is. And so there's a couple of things that I'm just going to talk very briefly about. The point is that none of us are programmers, and this, my director a couple days ago, reminded me how important it is to have programmers, and it is certainly very important, but the reality is it's hard to come by them. It's hard to get them, hire them. It's hard to hire them permanently. It's hard to get hours from them if they've already been hired permanently in your government agency, and it's also hard to give contracts for this stuff because some of it is really unknown future. So it's hard to say, just do this when it's a research scenario, and it's hard to do that. So we are all ecologists, many of us, wildlife biologists, some policymakers in the room, managers. The scientists here are not programmers. So what SpaDES is enabling is the non-programmers of the world to really bring their science to this, incredibly powerful space where their models are interoperable. So simulation models, or this SpaDES, Spatial Discrete Event Simulator, is a tool where we can bring models in the form of modules together, and they will interact. They can have as much complexity as they need to have, each one of them. They can also be incredibly simple. That's sort of, not an issue. Models communicate via data flow, and this is a sort of a critical point. We won't go into the detail of that. Time units can be anything from seconds or sub-seconds up to years or decades. It sort of doesn't matter. What is a critical novel feature of this is this idea of really connecting directly to raw data. And so you're never separating the simulation parts from the raw data or the data analytics, regression equations, boosted regression, whatever. These are part of a system that is a continuous workflow system. Very briefly, and we're going to dive into these a little bit more, as we've already benefited from this in this project that we're going to present a little more of. We had, a few components, and as the project evolved, we just sort of kept adding pieces to that. A few weeks ago, we had a problem that was only detected by the bird subgroup. And it turns out, as we're trying to debug the bird part, it turns out that the whole thing went way back through the vegetation components, all the way back to the raw data of the climate data. And there were some inconsistencies with the particular data set that we had downloaded. And so because we had this continuous workflow, we were able to just change that climate layer and then quote hit run, and we're just back in place with exactly where we were before with the problem corrected for the birds. What if we have more processes to consider? We just added a piece, and it worked with the system. Now, just adding the piece itself might be sophisticated and complicated and long and took 20 years of science to get there. But the SpaDES enables the capacity to just add those pieces. One that we are utilizing in an incredibly powerful thing is this different study area. So we are working on another project concurrently, the Regional Integrated Assessment in Yukon and British Columbia, and it has different objectives. And yet there are some pieces that are reusable, and those components that are reusable, we just bring them over here. And critical in that is we often find errors in some of those common pieces, and they immediately get fixed and moved to both. Okay. And I think that's all I was going to say about this. And so the take-home messages are from this beginner introduction to what is SpaDES and why are we using it, is that we have limited time and resources, and what we need is for all of our science to be interoperable and then reusable. And so this is a message that we will be continuing to convey. We have the third draft of the manuscript that's describing all this, and it is going around. It's around with the co-authors, and so we'll be submitting this very shortly. And so that's the end of that. So I'm going to switch back to this, and I will complete my first section here. So that is the why SpaDES and response to question 15. With that.
Okay. Thanks, Elliot. So we're roughly 8:26, 26 minutes after the hour. If there's questions on what Elliot's presented so far, we'll just save them for now. We'll go to Tati to have her lead a short presentation on what's been done for the NWT project so far. So Tati, I think Elliot has control unless he gives it to you, so you can either...
It's up to you, Tati. Would you like control or just tell me to advance the slides?
Go ahead.
Okay, you might have to speak up a bit there, Tati. You're quiet for us here at PFC.
I'm going to turn off my camera just because of bandwidth.
Okay.
I'm not sure about the bandwidth here, so I can speak a little bit. So as Sam said, the project started, the Northwest Territory project, the NWT project started, we started discussions roughly in August last year, and but the project itself only actually started in December. And here you can see a timeline. So between December and January, we started the project, started the meetings. Between January and March, we brought everything into the SpaDES framework. And in March, we had already some first results. And we were not super satisfied with having the project without climate sensitivity, for example, for fire and for forest succession. So between April and September, we added the climate sensitivity component, and this is something that I'm going to discuss a little bit about in the results, the difference between the climate sensitive and non-climate sensitive. September to November, we had already results, so we started going down deep into the ecological realism of these results. And for example, that's when we found out that the bird outputs were looking weird. So we started going back, so what can this be? And we went all the way up back to the original climate layers that were being downloaded from Climate NA. They were fine if you downloaded them, the ensemble ones, but if you downloaded for the one of the scenarios. But they were not fine if you downloaded them annually. And so we also managed to get in contact with Song Lee, and he's looking into that. But that's interesting. That brings back what Elliot said already. So downstream, we can notice a problem, and we can go all the way up. And what we did was switch the model to a model that actually had good annual layers, and we already have results. The results you're going to see here today are the ones already from the the new run, let's say, with the corrected model. So December, we can see this workshop, and we have some rough drafts already for both the caribou component and the bird component, the first bird component, and we are hopefully gonna have these drafts to the co-authors by January. So this is a short timeline here. Elliot, you can move to the next one, please. So what does this project look like? So this is a conceptual framework for on what this project looks like. So this is the first full integration of spatially explicit modules for the simulation at a nickel-zone scale. So I'm going to show a map afterwards, but this is how we connect data and the simulation models. And we get all the way from climate layers to disturbed landscape and focal species. We have some birds, about 90 species of birds, boreal birds, and also some caribou components. And then we get all the way down to diversity and trends and sort of a concurrence analysis that we are thinking about implementing for this next proposal. Yep, next one. So here we can be a little bit more specific about the reports and the manuscripts. So in March, we sent our first report, and since then we have already updated it twice with the new outcomes and new models that we have been updating. So this is a very interesting thing about this workflow we have. While I'm working on, for example, with Diana Strawberg on improving and changing bird models, which we had 4 different versions of bird models tested already, the team that is dealing more with the landscape, the forest succession module, have been improving their end, and we can do that kind of concomitantly. So it's I can incorporate changes and improvements in the fire model and in the vegetation model and change bird models all kind of at the same time. So we also had 3 conference presentations, one in July, if I'm not mistaken, the AOS, one in August for the caribou, more specifically. I presented one about the integration and the birds also in August. And as Elliot mentioned, we have 6 manuscripts in prep. 2 of them are very close to submission. So one is presenting the whole framework, this predictive ecology idea, this, let's say, reinventation of the predictive ecology. And the other one is the first succession one from Dr. Barros. And 4 of them the other 4 are being drafted still. 2 at least of these that we are hoping to have a rough draft by the end of January. Yeah, next please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the results of the project right now. Here we can see the BCR6, the bird conservation region number 6. That our study area was the BCR6 within the Northwest Territories for the predictions. But for the birds, for example, I'm going to talk a little bit about this afterwards. We fit the models using the whole BCR6 data, and I'm going to explain why in one of the questions. You can see here the delineation of the Adesia area, the Adesia protected area in red. And this is one of the main interests was to identify, is Adesia a good candidate to be a protected area for wildlife? How is it comparing to other areas outside it? And this is one of the deliverables that we are hoping to achieve very soon, to have results for that very soon. I'm not going to go into details of that. We have some preliminary results on that, but I'm not going to present it today. Okay, next, please. So here are some results about the vegetation dynamics. What we are focusing mostly for, at least for this first manuscript, is let's say, the cumulative effects of the climate, this climate change that we're seeing on our, let's say, our subjects. So on vegetation biomass, for example, on fire and on birds and caribou. For that, we develop a factorial analysis. And we have all the combinations of climate sensitive and non-climate sensitive models for fire, vegetation, and birds. And caribou, we are only using one set of models that is from ECCC. So this is a little bit of background. So I'm going to present what we found regarding the effects of climate change in each one of these components. So here you can see and by cumulative, I mean, for example, on birds, we have both direct effect of climate, but we also have indirect effects of climate on fire regimes, and we also have, and from that, on vegetation, and also direct effects of climate on vegetation, and from that on birds. So here you can see that the climate sensitive models have a slight decrease in biomass in comparison to non-climate sensitive models. So we can see that biomass decreases with the effect of climate is decreasing biomass a little bit, but it's not brutal. It's very small for now. Next, please. And here we see, regarding vegetation, the leading species. So by leading species, I'm saying we classify a pixel based on the species that if a species has more than 80% of biomass, we classify the pixel as that species as a leading species. So here you can see the list of leading species, for example, Populus tremuloides in brown, which is a trembling aspen, and mixed would be the ones that they don't have a specific defined leading species, so they are mixed stands, and so on. So what I want to draw attention to this map is I wanted you guys to see how, let's say, orange the southern part and the northeastern part of the map are, which is mainly being led by black spruce. And next, please. And here we can see that even without climate sensitivity, we have some takeover of deciduous species. So we don't see so much black spruce in the southern and the northern part anymore. But we see a rise on trembling aspen, for example, and some of the white spruce as well is also increasing a little bit. And one interesting thing we can see here, and I don't think we can note it in any other map, is if you look inside the DESE, for example, we can see that the climate sensitive model, it shows inside the DESE shows way more pixels populated with vegetation than the other one, the non-climate sensitive, and that's mainly driven by fire. As we have the climate sensitivity in fire, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but the climate sensitivity in fire, let's say it's generating more fires with climate change, but it's not increasing the area burn. And that's because, so the fires are smaller. We have more, but they are smaller, and that's mainly due to the feedback from this increasing deciduous vegetation that is less flammable than conifers, for example. So next one, please. So here we can see we don't have, this is a plot of, let's say, the relative biomass per time. We can still see the same species, so brown is Populus tremuloides, the trembling aspen, the yellow is the jack pine, purple is white spruce, orange is black spruce, and the other ones are the two other deciduous. What I wanted to show is that, for example, in the climate sensitive scenario on the right, we can see that we have an increase in Populus tremuloides, in trembling aspen, and also a little bit of white spruce, but they don't take over as much black spruce as they take over in the other scenario, in the non-climate sensitive scenario. And we are still going to, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but we have already a new version of the parameterization module for the landscape vegetation module, for the lander module, and where we are hoping to get a little bit more of the, especially jack pine and some other the other deciduous species that we think that might change with this new implementation of this new parameterization. I'm probably going to talk a little bit more about this. This was not done yet for this run, but as I said, we can, for the next iteration, for example, already incorporate this change. Next, please. So here are the fire results, which are pretty interesting. So even though we see on the right-hand side, we have the climate-sensitive fire, which is also important to say, it has only 2 out of 3 components that are climate-sensitive. We are hoping to be able to integrate the last component soon. So fire is divided into 3 components. The first one is ignition, the second one is escape, and the third one is spread. And we only have climate sensitivity for the ignition and escape, but we don't have yet for the spread component. So we are hoping that once we incorporate this one, these plots are going to change a little bit. And on the left hand, you can see the SCFN model is a fire model that is not climate sensitive. So we see that they roughly burn more or less the same area, although the FireSense one, which is the climate sensitive one, burns a little bit less. But we can see that the number of fires in FireSense is increasing significantly through time. And that's what I explained before. So we don't have an increasing area burn, mainly probably because of the feedback of vegetation, the type of vegetation. Next, please. So here are some results regarding the birds. We are still working a little bit on the birds maps. We're not super happy yet about how they look like. We know, for example, that there are some other limiting factors that might be limiting Canada warbler to expand its range all the way up to the north. But the way I like to see this is this is also the effect of climate. So we reduce from the climate scenario, the non-climate scenario, and the two extreme ones. So the model run with complete climate sensitivity and the model run with complete without climate sensitivity for the three components: the fire, the vegetation, and the birds. And this is the difference we see. So the bluer, the more blue, the let's say increase in density. But I like to say it's the potential increase in density, because we know that we are not including all the possible variables that would limit these birds' range expansion, for example. And the more, as it goes towards the red, we see the decrease in density. So we see, for example, that olive-sided flycatcher, the OSFL on the left, on the far left, we see a pretty strong, we see some decrease on the south, which is pretty marked across the whole southern border of the study area. Although we see some increase near the mountains, the mountain chains on the far left, on the far west. And regarding the rusty blackbird, we have mostly a decrease, but it's but also a sudden pattern along the river. We can see some increase, but none of these increases or decreases are super pronounced. And on the far right, we see Canada warbler, which is showing a general increase towards the north. And it's interesting here that we did not predict southern of the study area, but I'm pretty sure that if we had, we would have seen a decrease in the southern part, which Diana has been showing that is happening. So the birds look, they do seem to be moving north with the climate change. And yeah, next one, please. So here we see some caribou results. Frances, I'm not sure you want to jump in, or should I keep going? You want to talk a little bit about caribou, or should I just?
Sure, Tati, I can jump in. So,
perfect.
If everyone can hear me. The caribou models that we used a resource selection function for the Taiga Plains ecozone as part of the Environment Canada 2011 scientific report. What this map here shows is the cumulative effects of climate change on caribou resource selection. So that's forest succession as well as forest fire being affected by climate change. And we're seeing throughout the next 90 years that caribou, the blue again, the same as the birds, are areas where they're expected to have higher resource selection as a result of that Taiga Plains model, and yellowish areas where they're expected to have lower. So we're seeing again that in south central Taiga Plains ecozone, we're predicting an increase in caribou resource selection of the habitat that's expected to be there, and in other areas, a slight decrease. Next slide. The second module we've developed for this project so far is the caribou population growth module, or the caribou demographics module. And this uses a relationship, again, developed in that same scientific report by Environment Canada in 2011, stating that the recruitment of caribou nationally is a function of the total disturbance of the landscape. So both buffered anthropogenic features as well as fire up to 40 years. And so what we see on the left of the slide, again, is vegetation and fire as those total disturbances without climate change. And on the right-hand side, vegetation and fire coming into that caribou module as a result of climate change. And we were asked to project the caribou population trends across 6 different polygons of the Taiga Plains ecozone. So that's what the 6 different colors represent on each of these graphs. And you can see that there's a dashed line around 1, a caribou lambda, or population growth of 1. And so depending on the polygon that you're looking at, we're seeing that across the next 90 years, with or without climate change, they're expected to be hovering around 1 with standard errors generally overlapping one. So again, the left-hand side of the slide is without climate change, the right-hand side is with it. Some slight differences, but overall hovering around one with some differences between polygons of that shapefile. Okay, next. We've been in discussion over about the last month of the possibility of using the SpaDES platform to look at some similarities and differences between Western science approaches and approaches using Indigenous ecological knowledge. We've had some really great discussions so far with the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium. They have a subgroup called the Indigenous Knowledge Consortium, just discussing about what state that group is at, connections, possible mutual interests that we could be incorporating SpaDES for Indigenous knowledge components. And just on Wednesday, we had a startup meeting with several people involved in this call, including Dr. Jean Polfus, discussing approaches of Indigenous knowledge and what we could maybe contribute to with the SpaDES platform. So we've currently used empirical Western science approach, but we're exploring possibilities of including an Indigenous knowledge approach for future components of this project. I'll let Tati take back here.
Thank you, President. So I think the take-home messages so far are that integrated discrete event models can help predict the future stages of our ecosystems undergoing rapid changes. And through SpaDES and a collaborative team, spatial and temporal trade-offs to complex conservation and natural resource problems can now be anticipated and addressed. So, yeah, we believe that this project has been showing us a lot of interesting, as Elliot said before, not just results, but also interesting, an interesting way of building a workflow that, of course, brings challenges, but definitely improves our capability of understanding what's going to happen in the future. So I think with that, we finish the session. Elliot, we go questions? Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Tati. We're going to jump into just going through the, I want to say it's about a dozen, maybe a few more questions specifically related to the results that we presented, but also some more specific details. And so for those people who are participating in this call that are interested in sort of the general ideas, we're now about to dive into some of the specific things which may or may not be immediately interesting or relevant for you, though who knows. But they are definitely relevant for the combination of the core team and the advisory committee. So there were 4 questions that we grouped together. We're going to answer them each, but they were all regarding calibration. So how are these models calibrated and tested? How is the calibration of tree species-specific parameters set? For example, growth curve, mortality shape, ratio of max biomass to max NPP, given the lack of plots of data in the Northwest Territories. Number 3, how each model will be improved, modified, calibrated, tested to be used in new jurisdictions being proposed, and then what data or subset were used to calibrate and validate the bird models. So I am going to be the coordinator of these answers. I'm going to answer some of them, but I'm going to redirect to various other people in some cases, as you know, this is a highly collaborative piece where not just the information, but the actual modules themselves are being made by a large diversity of people. So the first part I decided to answer about the open and transparent calibration for most of the models that we're using. And I mentioned to Steve that I would probably ask him to answer this question. And so this fire model, the SCFM, is up. Steve, could you please describe what this calibration does? On the left-hand side, what we're seeing is
I'm right here, Elliot. So you want me to take over then? Yeah.
Please do.
It's hard to go from the calibration to the final result. So the SCFM is a fire model in 3 parts. It models the start of fires, it models the initial growth phase, and then it models the propagation process, which produces the final size distribution. And it does this by means of a number of simulation parameters that are estimated directly from data for any given study region. So for a shapefile that denotes your favorite study region, let's, for example, in the Northwest Territories here, we intersect that with a geospatial database obtained from NRCan that contains the records of all the known fires that have occurred in that region. We select the fires of interest, say a period of time that we're going to use as our normal period. And for some of the parameters, it's quite simple. You just count the number of fires that happened over that period of time and divide by the area and number of years to get the number of fires per unit area and time. The calibration step for the other spread processes are a little more complicated. They have to do with the fact that it's really a percolation fire model that's being calibrated, and there's no real mathematics to tell us how to do it. The way we find the parameters is by an exhaustive automated process of finding the parameters that reproduce features of the data of interest, in particular the mean fire size. So what's happening here is we're looking at the results, the end results of that calibration process for 16 fire regions in VCR6 in the Northwest Territories. Each of the little dots on the left-hand side is one region. And we're looking at an aggregate statistic on the x-axis was what was the mean annual area burned based on the actual fires that occurred. And on the right-hand side, on the y-axis, is the simulated mean annual area burned based on, I forget how many years of running the model to record the number of fires destroyed and how big they got, adding up the total area and calculating our synthetic estimate of mean annual area burned. You'll notice points fall on a straight line. With deviances, variance is actually a little smaller than I would have expected based on theoretical results. So we can reproduce the mean annual area burned for a study area, and we also reproduce the mean fire size that's seen on the right-hand graph, and that's much closer. There's a stochasticity in the mean. So we get the mean fire size just about perfect as well. The other components of the fire regime, there's no point in showing them because mathematically they just have to be correct. So, this verifies that this very simple fire model can be calibrated to reproduce the historical fire regime directly from the empirical data. Elliot? Shall I go on?
Why don't you present FireSense also, please?
Okay, so I can do that. So the thing about the previous fire model is it is insensitive to climate, and it's also insensitive to variation in the landscape. It doesn't care if you're an aspen stand or a black spruce stand. It does care if you're water. That far we were able to go. So we account with various bits of cleverness for how much lake and whatnot there might be, rock and ice. Non-flammable terrain, more generally. But that's not entirely satisfactory. Thanks to research that I have done and others have done over the past 20 years, it's now becoming undeniable that vegetation has an important limiting role in the boreal fire regime. And of course, the effect of climate as manifested through annual variation in fire weather hardly needs mentioning. So how can we incorporate these additional factors into a landscape fire model? And our process has been, again, to continue breaking it down into multiple steps, the fire arrival or ignition process, and then the growth process. We're modeling fire on a raster grid. In this instance, the grid cells are 6.25 hectares, I believe. So the second step in that process is, does the fire get big enough to escape its cell of origin? And after that, it sort of percolates over the landscape. And the trick is to make all those processes sensitive to vegetation and fire weather. I don't know how am I doing for time, Elliot? Do I need to rush or should I go into some more details? I'm doing good, he says. Okay. Then I'll start off with the fire start part, because the ignition module. That's based on a statistical model published 2.5 years ago now by my former student, Elliot's former student, Jean Marchal, which exploited some nifty features of the Poisson distribution, which enable us to come up with a statistical model that relates the rate of fire arrivals per unit area and time to fuel type and fire weather. In particular, monthly drought code for July usually works out pretty well. The particular choice of variable depends on where you are geographically. That's all handled automatically too. So the data for the number of fires per area and year, we know where each fire started more or less. We don't know exactly what fuel type it started in, but we know within a few kilometers where it started. And we have the fuel maps, vegetation maps for the region, and we have a map of the fire weather. And with that, we are able to back out some fairly simple, nonlinear regression models that predict the response of fire ignition rate to monthly drought code separately for each of a small number of vegetation classes. And that allows us to predict ignitions on a changing landscape. The vegetation may be changing and the climate may vary, the fire weather may vary every year, but those are just inputs into the annual predictor for fire ignition, and that captures that part of it. So this is working more or less in most of Canada, where we've tried it. I'll skip over the fire escape part, that's working too, and get to the spread part. And that's very tricky, it turns out. We've developed a method for generating annual spread probability maps from vegetation and climate data, fire weather data, and the historical fire size distribution. And those worked pretty well. The method worked fairly well in Quebec and part of the Pessière-Amous, and the southern part, I forget the term of art for the specific part of Quebec that we were working in, about half the province. But when we've been trying to get it to work in other places, we're running into a variety of problems, partly to do with computational efficiency, that are now resolved, and partly as we think, we need to rethink the model a little bit. So it's not reliably working. This part is not reliably working outside of Quebec, in particular in our study areas in Western Canada. We're actively working on that at the moment. So FireSense produces, in effect, partial sensitivity to vegetation and to fire weather in terms of ignition and initial growth stages, but not the final relationship to fire size. Okay. I think I'll stop.
I'm going to stop you there. Thank you. Okay, so I also realized I forgot to remind everybody that we gave a document out a few days ago that has written responses to this, which I believe not everybody has, or perhaps everybody in this call does have, but I think we're not going to touch on all of the detail that are in the written responses. So for the biomass model, there are a number of parameters. For some of the species level parameters, we're using a space for time approach for species traits, and we're using the permanent sample plots across Canada to evaluate these traits. The methodology, what happened for the March 31st date is we were using values for these parameters that we got from the literature and other people who've been using Landis, and we had a suspicion, as have other people who were not in this project, that the parameters might not work for Northwest Territories. And when we used them and generated the outputs, it certainly seemed like that was the case. So since then, we've been working on developing new approaches, and we're sort of starting to see some of the results coming from those, and they are now looking much more believable, which of course is challenging. We still don't know if they're predicting the future, but that's the point of bringing the IPCC type approach into this, is where we keep generating predictions, not just us, but lots of people. So lander.cs, we didn't actually mention this explicitly. We put .cs on a lot of the modules, and that implicates climate sensitivity. That has been our designation. So we've been using the PSP plots for looking at the growth curve and the mortality shape and the relationship between maximum biomass and maximum ANPP. And we've been using the PSP plots from the boreal and taiga plains ecoregions, which this map shows more a larger group, but you can see the ones, they're depending on the particular project, we use different subsets of these. For birds, I would like to pass this to either Tati or Diana. I don't think we had specifically asked Diana to speak, so Diana, if you feel like speaking for a minute about validation for the birds, you can. Otherwise, Tati.
I'm not sure what the question is, so let's start and fill in, I guess. I mean, you want me to describe the models, or, I mean, I could, but I think probably Tati has something prepared, or?
Yeah. Tati, are you still there?
Yep. I'm here, yeah. No, mainly it was questioned about the validation of bird models. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I had some noise on my end. So there were some questions on what data subset were used to calibrate and validate the bird models, and in the written document we have more specified how much data from Alberta and from Northwest Territories were used. But what I can say is that we used both point count and also ARU data, and it was mainly used the Boolean regression tree for her models as well, for the national models with BAM, and I'm not sure, I think you guys are already including ARUs as well in the national models. And the Boolean regression tree uses some sort of internal cross-validation for this, and that's mainly the answer for this question. I don't know if Diana wants to extend anything.
Yeah, I can elaborate. I just don't know who's crackling, me or you, so I'm wondering if I should mute or if that's you that's crackling. Are other people hearing that? If not, then I'll go ahead and assume it's just on my end. All right. Maybe now it's kind of stopped. So maybe it was.
You only have about 30 seconds, so.
Okay. Yeah, so these are empirical models, and so that's why we wanted to include all of BCR6. It didn't necessarily need to be all of it, but we wanted to expand outside of the Northwest Territories in order to build model relationships that encompass the range of vegetation conditions and climate conditions that are expected to appear in the future. So we used the entire BAM data set that was available for this area, and in addition, some new ARU data. Those have been combined and then subsampled so that we didn't overly represent areas like Calling Lake that have tons of data. So there is a subsampling and a downweighting spatially that goes into these models so that they're not overly Alberta focused. That said, they do include, they do go down pretty far south into conditions that are probably won't be, observed in this area. But yeah, and they were validated with cross-validation. So. Okay,
thank you. I'm going to we're going a bit slower than I think what we had anticipated, so I'm just going to jump in and give some of these points. So with caribou, we didn't do specific calibration for any of the caribou modules. We used the ECCC resource selection models and national demographic models. what we did do was we made sure that the implementation was correct. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to jump onto question 5, so specifically about LANDAR, or LANDAR. How did you validate the land cover classification from satellite imagery? And essentially, we didn't. This is an input data set that we assumed that the original authors had done this, and they do, and you can read in each of these pieces. So this is one of many land cover classification data sets that exist in the world, and it has strengths and weaknesses, which sometimes it's hard to know exactly what those are, but this is what the thing looks like. I think many people have seen this and possibly have used it. LANDAR again. Why LANDAR cannot track changes in non-forested habitats? What are the limitations? And what about non-forested habitats that represent early stand development stages, disturbed habitats that should be tracked through time to simulate vegetation recovery? So essentially, LANDAR is based on Landis 2 biomass succession model, and so it only deals with the trees. There's possibly, shrub. There's potential to work with other layers, but its strength is with trees, and so it only does dispersal regeneration competition. So at the moment, there are not very good models for non-treed plants. We know that there are some exist in the dynamic global vegetation models. They have classes that are non-treed plants, but for this scale of this particular question, our experience is that has been inadequate, but of course, so is not representing them dynamically. But at the moment, that is how we are maintaining them in the maps, so fires can burn through those non-treed places, but they will not be. We don't consider them changing at the moment. So that includes things like we don't show wetlands that are changing, becoming more wetland, more flooded, or becoming less through various, permafrost changes or other drying or wettening. Excuse me. There are some parallel research efforts looking at this, one of which Steve Cumming is spearheading. So there could be certainly good things coming in this component, but they're not there. So figure 9 from the report, it looks like there's a breakpoint around 2070. What is this sudden nonlinearity? And this we've discovered was related to this climate data product that had that nonlinearity in it. So we've since changed that and reran all the simulations with different climate models, so we're not seeing that same breakpoint again. This is what that data product looked like. And part of the issue is that we were using the annual version of this data product. The ensemble version didn't have these strange data features in the data set, but the ones that we were using did, and so that was causing a whole bunch of downstream effects. So next question was regarding SCFM and fire sense. Please provide more detail about how the fire module works, in particular how the climate change scenarios influence fire disturbance predictions. So I'm going to go quickly through this because Steve did mention this. Basically, the 3 components, ignition and escape, those two have this climate sensitivity, as Steve described. I'm not going to go through that again. The spread component, the third component of the fire simulation, we several weeks ago, about 6 weeks ago, we solved a major computational bottleneck. We were able to get the stochastic optimization about 1,000 times faster, and so that allowed us to start to get answers to things, but we haven't. They're not available yet, but they are coming now. And the MDC, I don't remember exactly what this was for. Tati, if you want to say something about this.
I can jump in. No, this was just to show that the new layers are much smoother. The model we are using now, the climate model we are using now, is the CCS and with the RCP 8.5, and this is how it looks now in comparison to what it looked before with the little kind of squared kind of outputs. Yeah, that you see here. It's not exactly the same thing. This is the C, which is calculated from temperature and it's the moisture index, but it's just kind of just to show that now we have a way better data.
If I could interject, that was monthly drought code, which is an input into the ignition model. There's going to be more fires in 2100 than in 2011.
Thank you. Questions about anthropogenic and forestry. Why are you not tracking changes in human disturbance through time for multiple sectors and their associated stressors? Why are you only considered two types of human disturbances, road density and buffered disturbance layer? And are there structures that are easier to simulate than others? So the first thing is that, the first answer is that this was some prototype elements of what we were working on. So they were limited and, in the 2018 to 19, the NWT project, it was agreed that they would be static, and so that's how it was. In the Northwest Territories project, in the Western Boreal project, this is a major focus, and we brought in an entire new postdoc/research associate, Greg Parody, on at least the forestry side of this. We note that in Northwest Territories, the forestry is relatively minor component anyway across the entire region. In some very localized areas, it can be important. But I think the answers for this might be unsatisfying for now. But the point is that it was an early version. And why are roads measured as density and not area? These are rasterized landscapes. So it becomes a density of roads per pixel, and that happens to be the predictor variable in the ECCC 2011 recovery strategy RSF for caribou, so that was more relevant for us. If you assume a particular buffer size, you can convert between these, more or less. There's going to be some, they're not going to be perfect. Birds, how much avian data was available from Alberta versus Northwest Territories, and what extent could reported habitat and disturbance relationships reflect those from birds breeding in the Alberta portion? I think Diana has already talked about this a little bit, and so has Tati. And there are not as many points in Northwest Territories. Possibly this will overpredict if the biomass doesn't adequately capture the climate gradients, but still the chances this should be reduced when we have the climate and vegetation bird models together. I'm not going to say more about this because Diana, I think, already said it. More questions about birds. Instead of diversity, would it not be preferable to calculate a metric of community similarity of the community in each year, or the next year compared to the beginning? Although this was an interesting suggestion, it is not requested in the original contract, so this could certainly be discussed for the Western Boreal proposal if these sorts of things.
And if I can add to that, Elliot?
Yeah.
So that's actually something that I've been thinking about actually include in the Western Boreal. So it's something that is definitely going to be considered. Okay, Caribou. Please demonstrate the detailed steps that allow taking an output from Lander and translating it into the variables used in the Caribou RSF. So the Caribou RSF has many covariates. A large number of them, a sizable number of them were static, so they were not changing. So that includes things like elevation, I believe. Do you want to save this, or should I just do this quickly? Okay. Essentially, the critical ones for our situation is the proportion of deciduous forest, that's a predictor, and the amount of old and new burn. So these can be derived directly from the simulation components, either the vegetation or the fire, and then the development road density from the development module. The proportion of deciduous forest is, at the pixel level for the RSS, is simply classifying each pixel according to its relative biomass. So I think our threshold was 80%.
and, or I'm sorry, no, it would just be the actual proportion by biomass that is in deciduous class. And then the old and new burns, we know when every burn happened because we are the ones burning them, and so that's how they were converted. Caribou, the demographic model does not distinguish between fires and anthropogenic disturbances, but most of the herds that were used to generate this model were located in areas where anthro is several orders of magnitude higher than fire, so that meaning that the models were fit in most of southern Canada, and so Northwest Territories is obviously different. And I would like to know how you plan to generate these scenarios, and would these scenarios be spatial or non-spatial? So I believe, so we were basing these on that 2011 report, which is utterly, not adequate for every place and every project. And this is something that is open to modification, and we are already, we've already had a few discussions with GNWT, James Hodson, and a number of other people. We brought in Cole Burton into this project, and so some of his, we're going to start to bring possibly some of his work. We haven't discussed the details of what that is going to look like, but certainly we and the questions here indicated dissatisfaction with using the 2011 RSF and the demographic models. So I think that's basically where we are. We're bringing in more complexity for the next step. Why would the forestry sector be in a different module? So in everything we do is modular, so that they can exist in isolation and also be brought in. And so this modularity allows for us to reuse it in different places. The forestry and wood supply model that we have started working with Greg Paradis is based on an linear optimization approach, and we have generated a strategy for combining the stochastic models that we have shown here with the deterministic models that are coming out of these timber supply or wood supply models. And so with that approach that we have proposed for the Western Boreal, we can look at trade-offs between timber supply and a number of other indicators, including biodiversity, species at risk, carbon, et cetera. Okay.
Okay, so we are currently running a few minutes behind. We have about 20 minutes until a designated break. So we're currently at the point where we're going to open the floor on what we've done so far, how we've answered your questions, and see if there's any burning questions from others at this point. You'll see on this agenda that 2C, we will have time for more questions about the Western Boreal project coming up. And maybe if we have some extra time, we could answer some of the current questions in there as well. But at this point, I'll open the floor for burning questions. I believe you can either just jump in, or Elliot's monitoring the hands up signal you can use in WebEx to ask a question. I believe there's also a way that you can type a question into WebEx and we could read it from there.
Okay, so I might just warm things up a little bit. So just a quick question, I guess, I don't think we actually brought up, that just came to mind at some point this morning. I was wondering if you guys can speak about I think that's probably Tati, actually, that's not muted or something. I think that's the kind of background noise we're hearing. But anyways, my question would be if you guys could speak a little bit about permafrost, potential limitations, and how that could come into play in these future scenarios. So potential limitation of not including permafrost, and also the current limitations about being able to model wetlands.
Steve, I think I hear you.
Yeah, well, not being able to model permafrost is bad. Not being able to model permafrost is a big limitation. It's also not that easily solved. What I can tell you is that we have a grant proposal in with Northern Water Futures that may enable us to fund a postdoctoral position to actively work on that. I mean, there are models available. So the physics are known more or less, I guess, and the subject matter experts have various approaches, and with the help of this postdoctoral position, we should be able to integrate them into SpaDES without, there's no conceptual difficulty in doing so. It's just need someone who knows the subject to do the work.
Okay, I have
We have some more information here.
This is Céline Boisvenu speaking from Victoria. I'm a research scientist here. One piece of information that is new even to the SpaDES team, or at least part of it, there is a really nice map that is out from NRCan, from the Geological Survey that I just got for ice map. So what is permafrost, where is permafrost in the north, where is permanent ice and non-permanent ice, and that could at least be a base input. And because I use SpaDES and I know SpaDES, this is a map, we can bring it in. So there can be at least that as a minimum. The other part is that because I work mostly on productivity and carbon, and some of that, because we're in the north, we'll have to do, and Steve knows about this already, the biogeochemistry modeling. And in the longer term, I'm bringing in one of the biogeochemical models that does different biomes, and we'll be able to bring in some wetlands.
This is Elliot again. I just spent 3 days in Ottawa working on a cumulative effects workshop, cumulative effects workshop. The third day was this fantastic day where we brought all of the NRCan, a large number of NRCan science departments together, and I was in a small breakout group where one of the geological survey people said, you know, we have models for permafrost, and also we have models for projecting permafrost. However, it's very frustrating because we don't have vegetation models that model vegetation change. So we just assume that vegetation is static. And I said, that's funny. We have vegetation models that are dynamic, but we just assume that the ice situation will stay static. And we started that conversation, and we're still following, that's hopefully going to lead into something, very interesting. And the idea with the SpaDES interoperability is that they don't necessarily have to, depending on how they've written it, they don't have to rewrite very much of it potentially, and we might just be able to start using it. But anyway, so the point, Sam, is that there are a few fronts where there are some interesting possibilities, both, initiating projects, new data products, and models that are coming, obviously, from groups that are not represented presently. The second question was about wetlands. I think wetlands, I believe I don't have a good answer to that.
We need the hydrology for the wetlands.
Yeah, so there are, the conversations I've had with people about that include some conversations with some of the new CFS scientists who are looking at forest hydrology. So that is looking at the moisture water regimes coming out of forests. So that may or may not affect wetlands. I think the point is that when we have a large enough group like it is now, we start to get each person's networks are different. And so I think the point is that we need to find those people who are understanding and projecting wetlands. So certainly, Jen Balzer is one of the people that Steve works extensively with, me a little bit in the periphery, and I think that there is a place for those to come into this sort of ecosystem of modules that are interoperable, and I think we need to find those.
Yeah, no, I think that's a totally valid point, and just wanted to kind of highlight for everyone here, an obvious current limitation, which doesn't discredit anything about the quality of the work. It's just a limitation that needs to be acknowledged and worked on, next steps. So perhaps we're going to be talking about that in the next part of the the workshop. But maybe just a quick question: who was actually speaking earlier about like the ice layer and stuff? I missed that part.
Céline Boisvenu, I'm a research scientist here. The ice layer was. I can forward you the article that has that map if you would like.
Awesome. No, thank you. I just missed the name. Sorry. Thanks.
This is Lisa Mahan in Whitehorse. You said that you were testing elements of fire sense specifically for ignition and spread in areas outside of Quebec. Can you elaborate a bit on the jurisdictions or regions where you're testing it?
It's not so much testing as applying. It's working. Those parts are working reasonably correctly, as far as we know, in the study area that we're discussing today. So it's running over the BCR6 study area and I think the RIA study area as well. Is that right, Elliot?
Yeah, I mean, so there's some figures in the report, the answers to these questions. Sorry, not the report. So the document that was sent around to the advisory committee, where we show that calibration result, not just for NWT, but also, you know, the British Columbia project, and those are basically, that is the result of that semi-automated ignition and escape fitting to historical fire data sets. And so, as Steve described, they are taking the historical fire data sets and essentially generating, determining the parameters that would be used by the simulation model to regenerate exactly that fire regime. And so how many fire, like Steve said, the ignitions, it's a little bit nuanced because ignitions and escapes are what we normally detect. Well, we can detect all ignitions likely, but the escaped fires are the ones that we do a better job at detecting in these fire data sets that start in the 50s-ish. And so basically you're trying to regenerate those fire data, historical data sets by simulating them.
I'm not sure we answered the actual question, though, which is that some of the vegetation and climate-sensitive components are working in the areas that we're now simulating for the study under discussion. One aspect, the fire spread part, we still going to need some work, and we're doing that work as time allows. So it's partially working.
To be more precise, the reason why the spread wasn't working is we couldn't get the optimization to complete, and so it was just continuing, and it was taking days to weeks, and it was not completing. And so when we figured out how to make it 1,000 times faster, that we believe that should solve the problem. And since we didn't have specific funds to pay to Jean Marchal, it's been sort of being done on the side of his desk. And so the reason at this point why it hasn't been done yet is because we didn't have the funds or the personnel to do it, but we solved the bottleneck component.
And meanwhile, a bunch of work done. Sorry, go on. I was going to add some background detail to what Elliot said, but I don't think it's super critical at the moment. So whoever was going to start.
Lisa, is that adequate and a satisfying answer, or is it still not?
Yeah, I saw the figure for in the QA document for Northern BC. I just was interested. So I mean, what you're saying is it's working well in NWT in parts of Northern BC. So BCR6, maybe parts of BCR6, and maybe 4 in Northern BC. I just wondered about other parts of the Western Boreal, like Saskatchewan or the Yukon.
So then that's an easy thing to answer. Everywhere we've tried it, the ignition and escape it self-calibrates and it works fine. So we haven't, there's no reason to expect that anywhere in the Canadian boreal forest it won't work, because the approach it will keep running until it satisfies the problem, which is to regenerate the historical fire situation.
Okay.
I'm going to step in here. We have about 5 more minutes left for this open-ended question session before we take a break.
I have a question. This is Sonia Kakuda at the Great Lakes Forestry Center. I noticed that you use cumulative effects a lot in the presentation, and in the context of the Canadian Forest Service cumulative effects research, we're talking about combinations of anthropogenic and natural disturbances, and I'm wondering, to what extent are there resource extraction or development activities going on in the landscapes that this project is covering, and to what extent have you taken those into account in the modules that you've developed?
Okay, so I return to the title page here. So it's a great question. The proposal or the project that is completed didn't specifically have the cumulative effects wording in it. So we've been using it fairly subtly or nuanced at this in that NWT project, in part because there is relatively modest anthropogenic disturbance compared to the more southern parts of the boreal forest, and so it didn't come out as being one of the dominant things that we were working on. Having said that, obviously we saw a question that questioned that point, and so the best answer we can give is that that's coming out in the next project. So that's where we really start looking at the anthropogenic components, because we're bringing the project into the more southern areas as well of the western boreal forest. So I think that we are going to tackle a little bit more an answer that may be more satisfying in a little bit as we go through that project, and so hopefully we can.
And having all those projects all on the same time and space scale is revolutionary already. So just so we remember that this level of integration, in my 20-something years of modeling, I've never been able to achieve before.
You have time for one more question.
Okay, I have one question here, if I may. It's Junior Tremblay. I have a question about the lander species parameters, and what I'm understanding is that they are not yet well defined for NWT. And my first question, maybe if I'm right, it's what are the impact for the current simulations, and also you were talking about new approaches to better refine these parameters. So I'm curious about it.
Okay, so I can take that on unless, Ian, you feel like talking about it.
Sure. Do you want me to try? Okay. Hey, this is Ian Eddy from the Pacific Forestry Center. Yeah, so the approach we have now is using the permanent sample plots to estimate the mortality, mainly the mortality shape, growth curve, and the maximum ANPP parameters. One realization we had is that we've been estimating the maximum biomass on the landscape for spatially for these species, but we realized that depending on the particular combination of traits, it's possible that the species, even in the perfect growing conditions with no competition, never reaches maximum biomass, which would mean we're underestimating biomass on the landscape. So that's one benefit of this new approach, is we're going to adjust all of the parameters so that we're sure each species could actually reach the maximum biomass that we estimate. And so the other way the approach works is we use all of the available permanent sample plots to estimate traits for the entire, for the species, and it's not spatial. So it's a single set of traits, say, for birch or for trembling aspen. But then we use the spatial estimates of maximum biomass to at least adjust the ANPP of the species. And it's still preliminary, but from what I've noticed so far, it does have a substantial impact on the results.
I'm going to give a few more pieces of information. So we're using a curve fitting approach where we basically simulate on the order of, a factorial experiment with all combinations of these species level traits. We simulate all of them, and we fit those curves that are coming from Lander biomass simulation model to the permanent sample plots, and we rescale it so it's not about estimating the peak biomass, it's about estimating the curvature of those things. So as Ian said, the mortality and growth, and then the ratio of max ANPP to max biomass. And so what we're getting are substantially different values for those traits from published ones. One of the reasons we feel, and now I'm going to reiterate, which I probably shouldn't do, why we have different results is because the results that we took from the literature, the parameters we took from the literature do not achieve maximum biomass. Because, particular combinations in these nonlinear models do not. It's a hypothetical, and we actually have biomass, non-hypothetical biomass measures across the landscape, and so we had to make sure that we're hitting all of these. So, and then the final part is, so we do have. We've estimated all those parameters for all the species in the Northwest Territories and this project in British Columbia. We're using those as two test cases, and the behavior is looking correct in that they are achieving their maximum biomasses on the landscape, and we are visually confirming that the combinations of traits are matching what the permanent sample plots are showing that they do.
Okay, I'm going to cut in there and say it's time for a break. Thank you, everyone, so far. We'll take roughly a 5-minute break, so resume at 9:45 Pacific, or 45 minutes after the hour for whatever of the multiple time zones you're in. So we'll see you in 5 or 6 minutes. Okay, we're going to keep running a tight ship in terms of time here. It's 9:45 Pacific. So we're going to get going. For anyone just joining the call, we have spent the last hour and a half going through what work has been done for the Northwest Territories project in SpaDES so far as part of a proposal that was started last January. We've also put in a proposal to extend that project to the Western Territories generally. And so the next hour and 20 minutes or so will be spent going through a short presentation on what could be done as part of this project extension. Elliot will lead that. We were asked specific questions about this project proposal, and so we'll try and go through some of the highlights of those. We did provide a written document to many members of the phone call. Those who do not have it, we are welcome to send it to you after the phone call, but we'll try and hit up a few pressing questions from that document. And then we have roughly half an hour again for more discussion on this Western Boreal project extension. If there's extra time, we can go back and discuss some more questions about the work that has been done to date. So we'll go ahead and I'll pass it over to Elliot to present the Western Boreal project extension proposal.
Before I do that, Francis and I were just discussing that it felt like the open questions were just warming up, and it feels like we need more time for that. So we might bring the section 2B. We might go either quickly over it or just not go over it very much at all and dive into 2C, basically the open-ended questions that we didn't prepare. And in that, the people who asked the original questions can certainly chime in and talk about and ask, further follow-up. So I'll just try to keep 2B a little bit shorter and open up to 2C more quickly. So that, and I believe that 2A will actually be a little bit short as well, in part because it's mostly visual and not very long. Okay, taking the next step. This is the what we envision for the Western Boreal Project. We've called it Cumulative Effects of Wildfire and Forestry under Climate Change in Western Canada. Assessing the trade-offs between conservation and forestry management and identifying priority areas for long-term wildlife conservation. Basically, we have spent a lot of time building these visual pieces, and we feel that they speak very loudly, and so we're going to spend a lot of time on this picture right here, right now. And so, on the left-hand side is what we presented up till now, and there were clearly some pieces that were missing. For example, forest harvesting was not really present there. The other pest disturbances were not there. The anthropogenic disturbances were somewhat limited, as was pointed out. And there are other components like priority places that were not a part of it. So as we move to this next project, so in addition to changing the scale, which is I have the image of the study area is a bit further down in this as a response to one of the questions. So I'm not going to talk about it right here, but essentially it's what is considered the Western Boreal Forest, Yukon, Northwest Territories, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and parts of Manitoba. The components that are being added, so there are pieces that we are going to take directly from what we had before, and because of the building in of the semi-automated to automated parameterization and calibration, a number of those pieces, they are just working. And so as we go with the fire sense from the NWT project to the Western Boreal project, we have run it on various places outside of the NWT, like the RIA project, and we get it does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is find the correct parameters that regenerate the historic regime. In the case of fire sense, it does that while taking into account the climate variables, so in MDC, moisture drought code, and also the vegetation type. And so we have taken it from Quebec, tried it in Northwest Territories, and it partly worked. And the first time around, and we made it work, for the two components, and we believe it's now working for the third, but we haven't finished that calibration. And we tried in British Columbia, and it worked again. And so we have demonstrated that we can change the study area, and we don't have to extrapolate parameters from another region, from a region A to a region B. We just refit them, and we have sufficient data of sufficient quality, we believe, to do that. So one of the critical additions that we're doing is this forest harvesting one in the middle, because that is now a dominant component of the Western Boreal Forest. We brought in Greg Paradis, who is a postdoc and becoming a research associate at University of British Columbia. He's been working with us for about 6 months on this, and so he demonstrated one of the really important features of SpaDES is that he came and took a 3-day workshop about SpaDES and SpaDES module development, and he went away, and within a month, he had the first version of, working part-time, the first version of his WS3, which is a wood supply model, written in Python, and still written in Python, that is now callable from the SpaDES ecosystem, from the SpaDES platform. We're currently, we've had our first cases where it's now interfacing with the stochastic fire models, and so the timber supply or wood supply model that is based on linear optimization is able to start responding to stochastic changes in the landscape. So we have, the initial demonstrations that is happening, and it's as planned, and with a relatively modest extra, step that Greg had to do. If there are questions about that, Greg is on this phone, and so certainly many things we can ask questions directly to Greg on that. The other piece is mountain pine beetle is obviously a very important feature of the Western Boreal Forest. Alex Chibati has been the lead on one of the mountain pine beetle spread models that is in existence. There are obviously more than one, but that model hasn't been tested very much because there have been distractions on working on other pieces of this larger project, so integration, but also previous studies, a land web project. But this mountain pine beetle model, it exists now. The point of this project is to really bring it into a concrete use case, and that's where this is going to be, the spruce budworm model. And another example of a case where the module was written for Atlantis 2, and it was by Louis Robert, I believe, wrote some component of it. I'm not exactly sure what that is. He's on this call, and so he can talk about it. That enabled it to be SpaDES compatible. And amongst other things, there was at least one component of that process where he was able to use some of the SpaDES toolkit to identify some things that could be considered bugs related to how the events were interacting in the spruce budworm model. And so the spruce budworm model was developed by a team of people who, is not part of the, original SpaDES developers. It's developed by other people and was able to take advantage of a lot of the development, the SpaDES as a development platform that could be very effective. And Louis Robert is on this call, and so questions can be asked to him, I believe. If he hasn't been he wasn't asked to be available for that, but I would assume he would be. The indigenous ecological knowledge, we have brought that up. That is now becoming a very central part of this project. There are certainly many possible ways that this is going to be tackled. We have, like Francis mentioned, we had a first meeting with Jean Polfus and a previous meeting with the Indigenous Knowledge Circle. There are elements of this that are going to be about a SpaDES module, and there are both ethical and data challenges to that, and we're going to be working through those. And there's also a really important way that we would bring indigenous knowledge into this is through the governance level, where we do workshops where we show results, we show pieces of this, and bring in communities as decision makers, as knowledge holders, to evaluate the forecast, to evaluate the consequences of this forecast, to evaluate the assumptions, and ideally what will happen is this will be an ongoing, repeated process to bring Indigenous communities, or at least representatives of Indigenous communities, into the process of this. So that's sort of at least two ways that we're talking about bringing in Indigenous knowledge. So one being an actual module representing Indigenous knowledge about caribou, and another one at the governance level. So those are very, very early stages. There are many things that are not set in stone, and we are we are directing this in a way to try to make it what it needs to be to address the local community's concerns. I mean, we will certainly, one of the challenges is that there are going to be too many communities at this scale of study to be going to each one of them. And so that is one of the tensions that we certainly are addressing and don't have great solutions to, but we're in the process. The carbon here, there's a SpaDES-compatible version of the carbon budget model of the Canadian Forest Sector 3 that is being tested in Saskatchewan, and it appears to be working. We have Céline Boisvenu on this phone call. She certainly can talk about that if there are questions specific to that. It is as close as can be considered a implementation of the carbon budget model. It was implemented by a member of the CAT, the team, and it is again. It was a case of a model that was pre-existing. It was written in C++, and that C++ component, or that part of it, or the C++ representation of that model, was then wrapped to become SpaDES compatible. So we're seeing a number of cases where we have existing models that were written in different languages on different platforms that are becoming interoperable through the SpaDES platform. In the anthropogenic disturbance, we have used static road development networks. There is one of the British Columbia, a member of the British Columbia FLNRARD, which is the Forest and Lands and Resource Operations and Rural Development, is knowledgeable about SpaDES and has started to use SpaDES in his work. Kyle Lockhead, he works in the caribou team. One of the pieces that he developed was a dynamic road development module. And so part of the plan to bring in a more dynamic component, so not just for the harvesting itself, but for the road development component, would be to start using that piece. That has not been tested with these other modules, so there are always a few challenges, but the fact that it is already SpaDES compatible means that thresh, or that wall to entry, the barrier to entry is very low, and our experience has been that we can make that happen. The waterfowl, we have Antoine Adé, who is a PhD student working with Steve Cumming, who is spending his PhD...
And Marcel Darvaux.
Say it again?
And Marcel Darvaux, that's Unlimited.
I'm sorry, and Marcel Darvaux, co-advised, who is been contacted to enable the models that he's developed, or he's developing in his PhD, to be SpaDES compatible and be useful for this particular question. That's been a push from Sam and the team that he's been working with, the advisory committee and others, to bring that in. And the sort of a critical extra piece is this priority places. We talked about it, DG. So we didn't specifically mention it, but my understanding is this is actually an Indigenous protected area proposal. So that does involve Indigenous communities, Indigenous knowledge, and governance. But we also, there are other ones that have been brought up, specifically some in the Yukon. I will let someone else talk about it because it's just been brought up recently with Beringia. And one of the things that is really important about this is that there are a number of packages that already exist in R for building optimized protected areas networks. So Prioritizer is a package that, for example, that can be used. And so what we can bring is we immediately get to inherit that type of tool and apply it to this complex system of interacting pieces so we can be generating not only priority places based on today, but priority places based on the conditions going forward into the future. And I'm going to leave, that touches on elements of the harvesting module that Greg Paradis has been working on, where we can also bring in those the conditions that are going to be in the future. We can bring those into the optimization process through what he has called anticipation functions. And I'm not going to talk too much more about that, but there is this capacity within the harvesting and the capacity within the protected areas to be working potentially together so that we can be doing evaluation and trade-offs of these historically quite different land management processes. I believe that covers the new pieces. There are going to be details in the existing pieces that are new and enhancements. So, for example, the fire sense, that the spread component will, we're confident that will be available for this Western Boreal project. One of the things it's very easy to look at this picture and say, this is ridiculous. There are too many pieces. This is just, we shouldn't even bother to put all these pieces together. That's a very reasonable reaction to this. So that is one of the ways to deal. There are many ways to deal with the complexity here. So one of them is to focus on specific things. So once all these pieces are available to be working together, that doesn't mean they all have to be working together under every question. So for example, there might be specific questions related to carbon that can be the focus of a sub-project. Or there might be specific questions related to mountain pine beetle that can be a sub-project, and they can, they don't have to necessarily talk about, bring in the birds and the waterfowl and the caribou, maybe. Part two to this, reaction to there are too many things, is this idea of understanding the valued ecosystem components, VECs. In those, I've presented a figure here, which is, colloquially called spider web diagram. And here we've identified 6. These are at the moment hypothetical. So this is an example. This is not specifically being used. So none of the details in this have any bearing on anything real. Please do not go into the details and question what is here. This is about this idea. So we identify whatever the valued ecosystem components that we are interested in for a project. And we can generate scenarios, as people have done in the past, and we can plot them on here. And each thread going out from the center of the spider web out to the edge is how much of that valued ecosystem component objective are we achieving? Are we achieving 0% or 100% or something in between? And so in scenario A, for example, we do the best possible in the biodiversity valued ecosystem component, but we don't do particularly good on carbon sequestration. We do okay in old growth, very poor on the mountain pine beetle, causing the mountain pine beetle populations to decline. And we can go around the spider web when we see how good it does on 7 valued ecosystem components. Timber supply objectives reached. Whereas scenario B does less well on biodiversity, but does quite good on other components. And in this wonderfully magical example, we do really well on caribou and really well on timber supply. This is magic. This is great. And then C would be a different scenario. But the idea is, in spite of what appears to be a high complexity of the modeling system, we don't have to that doesn't implicate complexity in the evaluation of that system. We look at specific values that we need. And one can imagine that the values for Project A will be different than the values of Project B. And so then in the cumulative effects, what we get in this is we can, in these scenarios, we can be bringing in, harvesting and fire and climate change and road development and other linear features, and that can be a scenario, and we can do a scenario B where we remove some of those components. And so we can evaluate the difference between individual disturbances and cumulative effects of multiple disturbances from that scenario perspective. And because this whole thing, every piece is modular, that just becomes a simple procedure of removing components to get at specific subset or individual disturbance components. And that's different than doing all of the models together with all of the components and pulling out the specific contribution of each of the individual disturbance elements. Because cumulative effects, they may or may not be additive. They may be compensatory, and they also could be the worst case scenario of synergistic in a negative sense. If you have harvesting and linear features being put on the landscape, it might be a worse scenario for caribou than if you had just harvesting or just linear features, because you go past the threshold, for example. So pulling apart the dimensions of cumulative effects, this whole structure enables us to do that. I am hoping, so the last slide I was going to present here is the fact that these individual modules, they're not all at the exact same level of maturity. The x-axis here is a little bit truncated to fit on this slide, but 0 means it's basically in the process of being developed for our first release. And, this 1R and 1M, 1 means it's released and mature enough to be used for a particular project. And so there are some of these that they're still being developed, but others that are not. And so this idea of saying, well, SpaDES isn't ready, I've heard people say that a number of times. SpaDES has barely changed in the past 2 years, other than to make enhancements that are making things even easier. But it's about the modules themselves. That's the part that may or may not be ready or available. And Barry Snowden, who I'm not sure is on this call, he said he might be able to come, talked about he was wondering whether or not the harvesting had the richness yet as compared to what the British Columbia government is using in CELIs. And so we have this WC3 harvest is up here, WS3, and in the sense that it's mature and been used by Greg in specific instances. The SpaDES compatible version is still being tested right now, and so this could very rapidly go up to 1M. But the point is that these are elements that are being developed, some inside this team, some outside this team. And I think that is it for all I wanted to say. So that is much less than 30 minutes, I believe.
Yeah, we're running ahead, so we have roughly about 10 minutes still left in that 2A component. But maybe we'll just go ahead and let Tati lead answers to the questions that have been posed on this proposal so far. I'm sure some of them involve the study area extent, and those maps are coming up. So we'll just continue along with Tati.
Thanks, Francis. So next slide, please. So how we will evaluate conservation values for Deja now and in the future relative to surrounding areas, and how we will be able to identify other ecological hotspots or climate of refugia based on our indicators, for example, birds and caribou, is what we are focusing. Next, please. So Elliot said a little bit about this when he talked about the spots for prioritization. And we think that, for example, one of the packages we could use is the prioritizer. It's an optimization approach which is pretty similar to Maxent, but it has some, apparently it's quicker to give answers, and it gives us solutions that are cheaper as well. And it's been pretty well used, and we are considering using it for this question. It's possible to identify, for example, small areas with conservation value and compare current priority areas performance to potential alternatives, and identify the connectivity of these areas for the boreal caribou, for example. I don't know if Francis wants to jump in. We do have some more specific answers about the SSF, the step selection function model in this context. I think Francis can address that afterwards. Francis? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'll let you continue, Kathy, and get into the weeds on that later.
Perfect. And so yeah, just a quote that I really like from her is, species conservation is not just about implementing protected areas. It's making sure that these areas are connected is equally important. So this package, for example, would help us answer these kind of questions. Next, please. So regarding increasing the spatial extent of the simulations, will you prioritize which areas you will work on first and so on, and how? And alternatively, will the entire study area be processed simultaneously? So this really depends on processing power we have. Each province is, what we're planning is that each province will be processed separately. We have a pretty good idea on how much computing power we need to process each one of these areas already, and depends on which resources will be available at the time of this project to be developed. And for example, we could also still prioritize some areas or provinces according to ECCC's preferences. One area that has been brought up is the South Beringia, which is a priority place for in the Yukon, and we can absolutely, for example, use that, process that area first. So it really depends on what is available at the time, but we can kind of either go either way. We can do some parallel working on each one of these provinces, or cut them smaller to BCR within the province. We're still not 100% set on how to do it, so it depends on computing power. Next, please. So is there any possibility of expanding the analysis to deliver predictions for other priority species? I think that somebody just maybe just left this comment on the question when they send us, so we probably need to list specific species and to focus not only on priority places, but also priority sectors. And also the same comment, we probably need to specify the sectors of interest. So our answer to that, so yes, there is a possibility to expand the analysis to deliver predictions to other priority species. For example, when we invited Colberton, we see a pretty big potential of increasing the number of species and for example, bringing also not just caribou and birds, but bringing also, for example, wolves into the model. So we are open to these possibilities. Grizzlies also is a possibility. It depends on model availability. So if we have published models, it makes our job way easier because we can just bring it in these ready models. Of course, then we depend on how the models were fit, to which extent, spatial extent, and if we can generalize the parameters for other areas and etc. But if we have the models available, then it's fairly simple to bring them into our model, our big space model, the one that Elliot showed. And we also would also be interesting to have more specific questions and desires and deadlines to answer that a little bit better. It would help us address this question a little bit better. And of course, as I said already, we are definitely foreseeing some interinstitutional collaboration, and that would for sure help us to to increase, for example, expand the analysis to other priority species or other areas, priority areas. So next. So figure 4 was currently missing from the proposal. And could you provide yeah, thank you. So this is what Elliot already talked about, so I'm going to skip this one. Please clarify the BCRs and jurisdictions included for the proposed expanded spatial extent. So here, I'm sorry for the map, we missed the specific provinces and territories here, but I think we can just go over. So BCR 4, for example, which includes Yukon, BC, and part of Northwest Territories. BCR 6, which would be a small part in Yukon, most Northwest Territories, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. BCR 7, which would be Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Saskatchewan, a little piece in Alberta, and Manitoba. And BCR 8, mainly a tiny piece in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So this would be the proposed expansion. You can see in dark green the first, the Northwest Territory project that we developed. So it would be increasing considerably the spatial extent, which is a challenge on its own. As I said, we are figuring out how to deal with these bigger spatial extents and big data problems, but we have never tried such a big project yet. But we are pretty confident we can develop this within the time frame of the project.
And Tati, this is Alex. I'm just going to jump in, and I'll just add that in terms of the spatial scale, the LandWeb project that Elliot and I were involved with was just a little bit smaller than that, but it was also a fairly significant chunk of the Western Boreals. So we have experience working at those large scales. It's just that we haven't been using all of these other modules, all of these other model components. So that's going to be sort of the scaling up challenge that we'll face, not just running the model on such a large area.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, and we also showed a little bit of the RIA project, which also is also a pretty big area in BC. So I think we are well equipped to the new challenge. So can you clarify whether the anthropogenic module is being revised, improved to simulate human development for multiple sectors over time? Why is this module unlike other landscape simulation tools such as Landis, Alcis, Talis? This module cannot currently model the development and track the changes in development pattern of all key human disturbance and sectors through time. And so, Elliot, I don't know if you want to answer this one, because this is, you already touched on this a little bit in the beginning. I don't know if you want to come back to this, or?
Sure, and what I presented early on, which is, I believe, do I come back to it? Is it here? Yes. This same figure here, it partly answers this question. So Junior Tremblay, he sort of, when he saw this table, he pointed out, obviously there are something like 60 individual criteria that are being evaluated here, which is certainly not everything. It includes many things, but the really critical point of this table and this comparison is actually, it's comparing them as platforms for ecological model development. So what it is not doing is comparing them as, what are their pre-existing models, and what do those pre-existing ecological models, what are they capable of? So to go back to this question, there's a dimension of that, which is there are pre-existing models that do ecological things that are relevant. And while this is true, I sort of recall one of my critical inspirations for why SpaDES was created was I was working in CELIs, and we were using the harvesting piece, and we were using the forest growth piece, and then we needed a new thing. We needed this piece that we didn't have and couldn't get, so we had to develop it in SpaDES, and we just didn't have the skill to do it because it's not intended to be a general purpose computer platform for developing arbitrary things. It is really good at developing a subset of problems, and I took advantage of that for many years. And in fact, some of the SpaDES components and functions that are used are taken directly from the SpaDES abstractions. And I've talked with Andrew Fall about this, and that's clearly present and true. As we saw in this figure here, what the state of the modules, there are some that are as advanced as what SpaDES and Landis and ALSIS have, and others that are not. There are also many here that those platforms don't already have. So, for example, the priority places, optimization, harvesting, those are not in those other platforms as far as we know those other platforms. We certainly cannot be experts in all of those to evaluate how the details of them are different than the details of this. But critical point here is that we will have new components, and we need to be able to develop those. And these other platforms are not very good at developing new components, especially where there is a lot of domains happening with different expertise, and we can't develop new things for each one. So it's really about the interoperability. We can be taking Python models or Java models. The road development model is actually built in Java, and it's very efficient and fast, and we don't have to rewrite it. We just use it as is. And so to answer the question, we have, several of these components are part of the WB, the Western Boreal Project. So the anthropogenic components are in there, and they are being developed as very performant versions of these things. Some of them, it is the second response is that, do I have that here? No. Is that some of those sectors are very difficult to project. It is difficult to project the economy, which is going to be a major driver for the development of some of these sectors. Steve, please.
Yeah, it's important to understand there's a difference between the energy sector, the mineral sector, and the forestry sector. It's relatively easy to model the behavior of the forest industry because of two reasons. It's regulated, they're not entirely as responsive to market signals as other industries are, and all the information is out there. You know where the mill is, you know its capacity, you know where the trees are, you've got an inventory database. So you can replicate the planning with a certain amount of precision, certainly good enough for any of the purposes at hand. That's much more difficult in the case of oil and gas or any subsurface resource. I have worked on this with resource economists in Alberta in a past life. It's a very hard problem, and it requires subject matter expertise and access to data that, in many cases, is proprietary. And once so it's not doable. It's just a major effort, and there's particular challenges having to do with secrecy, or in the case of mines, with maybe 1 in 1,000 claims ever gets developed for reasons that are complicated. And the roads follow the development of those processes in large part. And I'll stop there.
I guess the last point is that the open, interoperable nature of this means that as those pieces are identified, that people are doing a good job with that, they can become part of this collection of models. And the fact that we haven't already identified the best economics and mining, dynamic projections at this moment is obviously less than perfect. Nevertheless, the idea is that the framework allows for that piece to come in as people are developing those.
Yeah, because we haven't done it doesn't mean it can't be done. Important distinction.
Tati?
Sorry, I just wanted to complement one last part on this. First, it's also important that we can do the whole workflow within one platform. We can go literally from data to the final output of the decisions, and we don't have to get out of a certain platform and bring results into another one, or give one working group data to develop, for example, a model and to run a model, and then they give back the data, and then we give to another group to do something else. So it's important that this can stay also within one, it's possible with space for all these to stay within one platform. And that's also pretty important for speeding up this whole process. For example, if we need to update data, or if we need to, for example, compare models or exchange fire model into a new fire model that's been developed, and so on. So, yep. I think I'm going to continue then. So in addition, some tools can also track changes in regeneration patterns for key human disturbance sectors or stressors. So our answer is that Lander Biomass does this, and we are also well into development of an assisted migration of forestry species that follows the BC strategy. This is being developed for the RIA project. I don't know if Ian wants to touch a little bit on that. Nope. Okay, maybe we can talk a little bit about this if it comes back up as a question. But this knowledge can be used also in other locations. For example, it's not, we don't have another strategies in place already, for example. Next one. So continuing this question. So what are the current limitations, and are you planning on generating different scenarios? For example, no development, 50% increase, 100% increase, and would these scenarios be spatial or non-spatial? For demographics model only, I believe this is touching more from a caribou perspective. So, yeah. So, I think, Elliot, maybe do you want to touch about on the species traits here?
Yeah, so species traits, basically we have now an approach that replicates the growth curves of the permanent sample plots with the sort of the curvature from the permanent sample plots. The actual spatial variation of those is driven by the spatial estimate of maximum biomass. So that's part of that. So then, in terms of scenarios, this is really about these engagements with decision makers and stakeholders. I had a conversation with Ontario caribou managers, and they said that they had a 3-year project, and within a week of the end of the project, somebody said, we can't live with these decisions that was about assumption and decision choices that were made 3 years ago at the beginning of the project. Sorry, it's changed. We can't live with them. And the team who was responsible for delivering, they said they could not go back and redo that with a new set of decisions or decision criteria, or particular valued ecosystem component, for example, or assumption. And that's baked into this whole process that we can do that. Now, we have to obviously be careful that that is not an excuse for never making decisions about anything. So that's clearly where you can go too far, where you never say, well, we're not going to make any decisions about anything ever. So, but the point is that this is an ongoing discussion point with the stakeholders, communities, and scientists, and policy makers and managers.
Thanks, Elliot. So please explain the need for an SSF, which is the step selection function. I'll leave that one to Frances.
Yeah, thanks, Tati. So a step selection function is quite similar to a resource selection function, which we've already implemented in SpaDES for caribou. The step selection function is more about measuring how caribou move through the landscape rather than where they are, and then for the resources they need to use from that. So I'm sure many listeners on the call are familiar with the Target 1 planning initiative of increasing Canada's protected areas to 17% of the landscape. That's going ahead for 2020, and many are in development, but many of them don't consider the connectivity, specifically the functional connectivity, or how animals move through the landscape to access different protected areas. So we proposed this module as really a bit of an essential but transformative step in protected area connectivity planning generally. We're already looking at potential biodiversity hotspots within this SpaDES framework for both caribou, birds, and potentially waterfowl, but it's important that those hotspots are also accessible by caribou as the landscape changes. With the projections of fire and vegetation change, the functional connectivity between those hotspots will change, and those need to be taken into account for caribou. I conducted some of these models and actually an extension of the step selection function for my PhD to empirically quantify functional connectivity of protected area networks. This module would involve telemetry data already collected for caribou and close collaboration with different territorial and provincial governments to update those data. But it's essentially a step above the resource selection function to include landscape connectivity in the protected areas planning mandated internationally for Canada. Again,
Francis.
Generally, though, sorry here. So how would you consider or integrate concerns from other jurisdictions considered in the proposed plan or taken into account? So correct, we are proposing to do this across multiple jurisdictions. This is really coming down to the foundation of SpaDES. So because SpaDES is open source and an adaptable framework, we're able to change the study area. We're able to change the concerns of jurisdictions and hopefully integrate them as the plan goes forward. This is not a static framework. So as new models become available, as more individuals would like to be involved, we can come back and keep improving this framework adaptively going ahead. So it's reusable, it's adaptable, and it's interoperable between all the different components.
So regarding birds, is there a plan, thank you, Francis, is there a plan to add the effects of anthropogenic disturbances in the bird model, or would it still be captured through changes in vegetation? So currently we haven't discussed this specifically. Our idea is to use, for the expansion of the project, the BAM's national models that Diana and Peter have been working on. And we believe that we can use a lot of the expertise of the BAM team in this one. I don't know if Diana would want to talk a little bit about this. Maybe we can leave it for the open questions, because we're running out. Okay, there we are. We're kind of running out of time already. So, Francis,
I don't have anything specific to add. It's okay.
Okay, I was going to say that's perfect, Tati. We have roughly 20 to 25 minutes to open the floor for more questions about this Western Boreal Project extension. If those are all satisfied, there's also maybe some time to go back to the question and answer session we had before the break, seeing as it felt that was just starting to really get going. So we'll go ahead and prioritize questions about this Western Boreal Project first.
Hi, this is Lisa Mahan. Can you go back to your proposed expansion area map for a minute? Yeah, that's it. You just passed it. Yep, thanks. Yeah, I want to focus on some of the questions around question 22 and 23 about anthropogenic disturbance. So I appreciate, Elliot, you raising some of these issues about the complexity of cumulative effects. They are complex because we know there's likely additive and interactive effects happening in different places. And I guess what concerns me when I look at this map is that there's two kind of different sort of issues happening with human disturbance across this big spatial extent. One is that there are jurisdictions here where forest management is not a key sector of importance. So like all of the jurisdictions in the north, the Yukon, the NWT, and portions of so BCR 4, 6, and 8. And then the other issue is that in the regions in the south, northern BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, there's kind of a different issue happening where you have a lot of different sectors operating at exactly the same time. So you have a whole bunch of sectors having important effects on the landscape. And I guess I'm a little dissatisfied with some of the answers given about, I understand, I've looked at your platform table. I understand strengths and weaknesses of these different platforms. But at the same time, some of those other platforms have been developing these economic process models. And, I think leaving these disturbances completely static in the Western Boreal is problematic to me. And so I guess I'd like to better understand either two things: why you're not trying to adapt existing economic process models from existing tools where they have been developed, like ALCES and CELES and LANDIS, or why you're not focusing on certain sectors where there's a long history of economic development, like the conventional oil and gas sector, or even placer mining in the Yukon, where you could use that historical data to actually develop, and predict patterns of spatial and temporal development over time. Anyway, that's my main question. I think I'd just like to know what you're going to do for this big module, which I think is quite important.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. You've nailed, you hit a nail on a really important nail right on the head. One of the challenges that my experience with these other platforms is that you can't inherit the research that has gone into those pieces. They are either proprietary in the case of ALCES, or they are a specific implementation which may or may not be proprietary for CELES. We don't know, but what's really important is they're very difficult to adapt to a new setting if you are not the person who developed it in the first place. And so it's a much reduced user group. So why aren't we using these ones that are already existing? Partly it's about the quite closed nature of development of some of those. So we struggle deeply with that issue, and feel that that's not a, we will try our best to take the opposite approach, where any of the tools that we are developing for particular things, they can be used by other people outside of this project, which creates this interesting, reality is that, let's say somebody who's working with ALCES could potentially use the components that we're using in some way, and so their project would have all their closed, ALCES components and also all of these open ones. And that is a feature of the open source development, is that it's asymmetric. So there's one way that models are moving into one group and they don't go back the other way. So certainly that can be tried. You create relationships with people and talk about those things, and that would be certainly ongoing. The second answer is that there's not just CELES and ALCES that are creating tool or models for the development of economic development. And so I think at this point, what we need to do is identify the more groups and more teams that are doing that stuff. So, and then, the last point is this idea of scenario. So I don't think we ever planned on it being static. What you can obviously do is talk about, we will present relatively simple versions as a default of, continued expansion at this particular pace, but without bringing in, the actual economic drivers necessarily. And so, those are it's not clear. We don't know how sophisticated some of those other ones are, and what level they're doing. So I think really this is about opening this discussion.
But if there was an economist that wanted to do this and put it in space, we just don't have the power. We're only so many people here.
Well, yeah, and so
let's put it that way. We could do this, but it's going to cost time and money, and in the context of this particular project under discussion, there isn't a line item for it.
So I think the point is that it's not excluded from this project in principle, or in fact, it's excluded from this version of the proposal. And what we are waiting for is, Lisa, you to help bring in the expertise that you're aware of, and get those people to be interested in contributing, and so they can, they can be a part of this project. My hope about SpaDES developed projects is that they are very, they are not strong barriers. They don't have strong barriers. They are, when a barrier allows things through? Permeable barriers. And so this project doesn't have to contain absolutely everything, because there are other pieces, like the RIA project is contributing to this project, but it's permeable. So where are the economic models, and who are those people who are developing ones that are sufficiently good to merit, using them in a project that's on the Western Boreal? The next, I don't know if those other models can we just don't know about all the details of those models. Can they handle the richness of the questions that we're proposing? Perhaps. The scale of this, perhaps. The point is, let's start working together.
Just to be clear, though, that in your QA document, you say that human disturbance will be treated as static variables, and then I just want to make sure I understand, you're not planning to bring in other experts as part of this Western Boreal work.
At the moment, we don't have those people identified yet, that expertise. So the proposal has not been submitted, as you know, and so if you know of people who have the capacity and and skill set to that are effective at doing these things, then they can do it. If they need to stay in a platform that is not interoperable with other things, then obviously that can happen concurrently, but you wouldn't have the capacity to bring in these that spider web idea of where we can look at more complex feedbacks between management system and the values of the landscape. We have some other people who want to talk.
Lisa, it's Frances Stewart here. I was just wanting to chip in there, because maybe not everyone on the call knows, but we are hosting a SpaDES workshop at the end of January, and there is room for people to attend remotely on the first day. So that is really a good way to generate these connections and potentially add to projects, so that people know what they need to learn. If they can code in R, it's not very much already, but what they need to learn to become more involved in this type of work. We also do workshops by request, so if you're interested or know others who may be interested in being more involved, please do get in touch, and we can consolidate something.
And just a last point, to the fact that we wrote that in that document, I think it is something we need to be more explicit about what this team can do as is, versus some strategies for bringing in other expertise.
Just now, I'm a little bit confused now, because I got that same comment Lisa brings up in terms of the Q&A document, but is it me, or maybe I'm referring to an older version of the proposal, but that the whole anthropogenic module to be static was for the NWT project, but for the next 2 years, if that bigger contract or proposal is being funded, the plan is to have it spatially explicit, right? It's costed already.
I think that is correct. So that is just an error, I would say. So we are definitely obviously several different dimensions of anthropogenic are being brought in dynamic ways. So then the issue is about some particular sectors and how we're bringing in those ones, but not the in general, anthropogenic is very dynamic, but specific sectors that we don't have the expertise yet involved in this project, we need to address that. And the scenario approach is one way to do it, where you don't have a good predictive capacity. You can at least say, well, given the, we can come up with, ideally sort of extreme case A versus extreme case B versus, and you look at them that way, where you have uncertainty in the forecasting. So I think that's an error in that, as you pointed out, Sam. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So for some sectors, there's a plan to simulate change. It's just a matter to have a more thorough discussion about all the sectors that are absolutely required and prioritizing them and costing them, probably fine-tuning the actual proposal to reflect that.
Yeah, that's correct, Sam.
We have roughly 10, 15 minutes left officially on this call. So I'll just ask if there's any more pressing questions about the Western Boreal project expansion. I'll take that as a no. Any more questions or discussion generally about this work and what you're touching on before the break?
Mathieu Leblanc here. I do have a question about the new proposal. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the new dynamic road development module that you quickly mentioned. So can you describe that, and maybe is there an option of, so you talked about adding new roads, so will there be an option to also remove roads, kind of like in the restoration project?
Kaya Lockett is not here. Josie Hughes has also worked with that road building module, space module. She's adapted a little bit. So I am going to not answer because I don't know enough about it. Neither of those two people is on this call. And so I will have to defer that to one of those two people. Apologies about that. And in terms of deactivating or removing roads, that's I don't know. We'll certainly. I mean, we're obvious. All of us are in regular contact with Josie Hughes in our lives. So.
I'm almost sure that there's no road deactivation being modeled in there because that wasn't the purpose for the development of that module.
But it might be an EV6 because it's the way it's coded. Not sure.
And so Josie Hughes definitely adapted it to more cases that were relevant to the caribou situation. So, and I talked to her about it very briefly a few weeks ago.
Okay, thanks.
The most comprehensive I know for spatial modeling of the resource sector, the energy sector, in respect to caribou, was done by Grant Hauer and Victor Adamovich in Edmonton some years ago. I can look into that.
And it's important to note that there are, these are all relevant points. I mean, indigenous knowledge is a very relevant addition that's come in, relatively recently into this proposal. The anthropogenic components we knew about and were capable of tackling a few of them, and it is clear to our eyes that that's also not sufficient. So the challenge is what are the pieces that we can do, and I've generally been tentative and hesitant about bringing in sort of extremely simple versions of things. So the harvesting, for example, Greg Paradis' timber supply or wood supply planning module, has a lot of richness in it, and there's a lot of capacities in it. And so that was a clear and obvious piece to spend the time on to bring that in so that we could do rich wood supply modeling and, harvest planning. And we, over the summer, one of our team members, generated, in a couple of days, a spatial harvest generator, but it didn't have the richness of that, the WS3 model of Greg Paradis. And so, it's not that difficult to make simple models for these things. And in the case of needing scenarios, that is a good way to go. And I think we were just hesitant about having something that was too simple, and that doesn't mean that the rich ones don't exist for the mining sector. We just don't know. But Lisa, if you do know, bring those together with this proposal. I mean, this is a good time.
And if I can go back, it's Tati here. If I can go back a little bit to Lisa's question, I would like to read the specific part, let's say the static versions. Lisa, can you please correct me if this is not the part you mentioned? So it says our static versions of these processes, talking about these other anthropogenic processes, are simply placeholders until the work to develop and implement economic processes models has been done. With the exception of forest management, that work is outside of the scope of this project. Is that what you're referring to?
Sorry, are you asking me?
Yeah, that's the part on the Q&A document that you were referring to, the static version?
Yeah, and in the table itself, you kind of just list these as static map inputs. Okay, yeah, because our idea is that, so maybe we're not being super clear about what static for us mean exactly. So I've been talking to Alex Trabadi about how to implement these processes as close to reality as possible. And obviously, Elliot already explained it's very hard for us to do that because a lot of this is outside of our own background. But we've discussed about not the maps being static in a way, but as not being simulated. But it doesn't mean that we cannot change these maps with time on the simulation. So what I mean is, for example, we can have a map in 2011, we can have another map in 2021, or another map in 2031. It's just that these maps are we're not gonna have a process of simulating how these changes are happening in time. And maybe that's where the confusion comes. Yes, they are static because they are specific maps with like a snapshot in time, but that doesn't mean that, for example, we are not expanding a road or we are not expanding a settlement or something like that. So we are definitely looking into being able to do that, to at least have some snapshots in time where proposed developments, for example, could come in and things like that. I don't know if that helps answering the question. Yeah, no, it did. I kind of assumed that you would be inserting kind of snapshot maps like at some time interval just to update that static information.
Absolutely. What we meant was that there would be a dynamic process model generating the snapshots.
Yep, I understand that.
Not yet, anyway.
Sam, do you have anything?
Yeah, so I was wondering, so what's the plan for just wrapping up the last 5 minutes? Is there like a quick plan on talking about potential next steps or whatever?
So we don't have that specifically, but The time frame is that what we understand is that this proposal has to be ready by approximately mid-January. And so there's still a little bit of time for modification. And so I think, Lisa, your comments are really relevant to that, to what we are going to put into the proposal. And it feels like this permeable, this open approach is really conducive to bringing in the complexity that is necessary for a particular thing. And part of the challenge is finding the people with the expertise that, And so, if you have, some of that knowledge, email us and we can either try to contact those people or, whatever, so to create that collaboration.
Yes, I will.
So I guess I just want to emphasize the fact that, we hope that everyone on the phone will be acting and kind of sharing the information as much as possible. I know that's kind of a role that I put on the advisory committee to be their kind of own regional or departmental kind of rep so that they speak about this project, because we cannot connect with everyone all the time. So I think that the onus is a little bit on us to make sure that whatever kind of module we think is really important is to kind of at least trigger the momentum to get the subject matter experts involved. So I think that's super important, and I guess that's the whole advantage or the whole thing about that whole process being adaptive. So just maybe to make sure that things are clear, like the NWT project with all its limitations, I think it's a really cool project with some of the knowledge that we have and actually bring forefront the state of the science right now. So I think that and also given the timeline that the project was actually conducted, and then the next step is really to get as much feedback as we can possibly get in order to put together a proposal that is multidisciplinary and allow meeting objectives from SRCAN, CWS, and even indigenous partners, and also territorial and provincial governments, while acknowledging that the money will have to come from, while acknowledging the uncertainty in terms of funding at the moment. To be honest, what we're actually visioning in terms of potential support within ECCC or CWS is throughout GNC funds with the Pan-Canadian approach and nature funds. So those are options that were brought up. If it's the priority species stream, priority place stream, there's all kind of venues that could be looked at, although there's a lot of uncertainty still, given the government, etc. But there's something that's really clear is using the Pan-Canadian approach, GNC funds, I guess, or the nature funds, it requires in-kind contribution match funds. So it's going to be really important for everyone who's actually involved in this project to try to reach out with with academia, so partners from academia, but also industrial partners. So that's where forestry and all these anthropogenic disturbances module can be quite probably relevant for them, and because we don't have industrial representative on the phone that I know of, but I think that's part of the further integration that we're probably going to need if we really want to be comprehensive in the next 2 years.
At this scale, we need to be talking FPAC or COFI or TAP, not individual corporations. And that's going to require, it's a heavy lift to get their attention, and they need to be approached from that level.
Yeah, and people like you and others have experience dealing with these groups, so I still believe that, they are in their tower and whatever, but I still believe that we have some connection, and we can actually make some further connections and flag this project and the relevance. So I don't think that's not achievable. It's just that it would require some dedicated time.
Yep.
So agree that the next step is it still needs to be confirmed in terms of the level of detail that is required for the proposal by the end of January, and the proposal for end of January is for a call for GNC. So yeah, it's true that the clock is ticking, but I don't think it requires a heck of a lot of detail at this point. It's kind of more flagging interest, but I think that was the reason I was pushing Tati and the team to actually start costing these specific items, because I think it's not necessarily the funding agency at the moment is actually doing a lot of the pushing, but it's really the advisory committee to making sure it's a peer review process pretty much, that if we can do all that peer review process, then we can be feeling comfortable on supporting such an initiative that is, to be honest, it will require significant funding support. And so I think that's really what our intent here with the workshop, really to try to convince the scientific, or our scientific committee, I guess, that should be the way forward. So yeah, I don't know how we should be wrapping that up, but is there kind of a mean in place to try to gather any additional feedback at this point? Is there a way to kind of, yeah, so next steps, maybe we can follow up by email. So I don't know, Elliot, Francis.
We don't have a specific plan at this point, other than, the core team. We, are going to be revisiting all of this stuff in the short term, because we know about the proposal deadline. So, I think each of the people involved here should be tapping into their networks of private sector and university collaborators to come up with both in-kind and potential cash contributions, as you just said. I have a meeting with the head of department at UBC Forest Management Department on Tuesday next week to talk about this and to, come up with funds from UBC. My understanding, Sam, is that the leveraged funds or the matching funds, it can be 0% of federal dollars of any granting agency or any government agency. That includes NSERC, it includes Genome Canada, or provincial government, are unavailable, are not considered in the matching requirements. Is that correct?
Before saying yes or no, I would say maybe. So I don't think it's that black and white necessarily. So things that I might not want to have on record.
Okay, so can we get a very specific description of what is available, please?
Yeah, we'll definitely need to do that, and that's totally me having to deal with our GNC folks and stuff. So yeah.
Okay, I think that's a wrap.
Yeah, I was just going to say we have been attempting from a couple different sources to record this call, so that's available, and we have our names here. Please do feel free to get in touch with any of us as we go forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to flag that there's at least 10 or 15 person who actually said that they really wanted the recording and they were not able to attend, so I expect that there's going to be quite a follow-up perhaps.
Okay, excellent.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thanks, Paul.
Okay, thanks. I'm just on the recording here, and if you want to debrief a bit, that's fine.
Okay.
Yep,
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Merci.
See.